My name is Gordon Edwards. I'm the president of the Canadian Coalition for Nuclear Responsibility, and our organization has been concerned with this issue for over 40 years. The issue being what to do with radioactive nuclear waste. When the nuclear industry began, they didn't tell people that there was a problem with waste. They said it was clean energy. And for the first 30 years of the nuclear industry, 40s, 50s, 60s, right up into the 70s, there was really no acknowledgement that this was a major problem. It was only around the middle of the 1970s that reports began to come out in the United States, in Britain, in Canada, about this terrific problem, because the nuclear waste is going to remain dangerous for literally millions of years, and it is so toxic that it surpasses all other toxic waste that we've ever known. For example, in Canada, there was a report from a Royal Commission on Electric Power Planning, which made a calculation that just the waste from one nuclear reactor in Canada, just 1 year's waste, would be enough if you wanted to dissolve this to the maximum permissible concentration of radioactivity. You would require a quantity of water approximately equal to Lake Superior. And now you think about 20 reactors in Canada operating for 30 years each. That would require 600 Lake Superiors. We don't have 600 Lake Superiors. And that means that to store this waste, it has to be not just 90% perfect or 99.99% perfect. It has to be far more perfect than that, because if only 1/1000th of 1% of this material leaks into the environment, it's a disaster. So this is why it is really an unsolved problem of the human race, because we have not successfully disposed of anything in our entire history. So why should we begin with the most toxic material that we've ever known and say, oh, we know how to dispose of this, even though we've never disposed of anything else? And so what we have here is a scientific lie. It's really using the scientific priesthood, or putting on the robes of the scientific priesthood, to tell people, rest assured, science will solve this problem. The fact is, we don't even have principles of science that can predict what's going to happen in such an enormously long period of time. We have no method of science that will tell us that when we put something in one place, it will stay there for the next million years. In fact, nature has proven us wrong time and time again, because nature is the great recycler. It has ways of recycling things that you wouldn't believe would be able to be recycled. We found DDT in the middle of the Sahara Desert. We found DDT in the Greenland ice sheet, even though DDT was never used in those places. So it just shows that this material, nature has ways of circulating it around the globe. So this is the bottom line, is that if we do not have a solution to a problem, we have to begin honestly by admitting that. And that means that having no solution, we have to figure out what is the best way to keep it out of the environment. And the best way to do that is by having constant monitoring and surveillance and making sure that that waste is accessible and retrievable for safety purposes. Now, granted, people don't want to have this waste in their communities, but there it is. We have produced this waste through nuclear power, and the first thing to do is to stop making more of it, because this just makes the problem worse and worse and worse. So we should stop making it, and we should make sure that it is packaged in the best possible way, and that there are people in charge who are available to monitor it for the long term in the future, and able to repackage it and retrieve it whenever necessary to make sure that people are protected and the environment is protected. If and when this stuff starts to leak, that somebody should be able to blow the whistle, ring the alarm bell, and say, hey, we've got a problem, let's get to work right away. We've got to stop this from getting worse, and in fact we have to go back to a more stable configuration, that is, repackage the waste and make it safer. So this is what we should be concentrating on here. We call it rolling stewardship. This is a concept that was actually developed by the National Academy of Sciences in 1985 in connection with other types of toxic materials, not radioactive materials, but things like heavy metals like arsenic and mercury and lead and so on. They said that you really have to have an institutional commitment to having an organization that will monitor this waste and that will be ready to take action whenever anything starts to go wrong. And they must have the resources and the knowledge and the expertise to be able to deal with that problem. Now we're suggesting something like a 20-year turnover, so that every 20 years or so you could have a kind of a changing of the guard. And this could be done with a lot of fanfare and publicity, because it's important that the community know about these problems and how well or not well they're being looked after. The reason for community awareness, and this is long-term going into the future, the reason for community awareness is so that the resources will be made available, because people will realize it's in their own best interest to make sure that sufficient resources are available to do the corrective action, to take the corrective measures. And so the idea of a changing of the guard every 20 years would give a chance to have this broadcast on television, and to have the new people who are taking over the responsibility of monitoring this waste to be fully informed. They will be told, okay, this is what we know about this waste, this is why it is so dangerous, this is why you must take every precaution in order to maintain it in the best possible state. And we expect you, as the next incoming guardians, to improve what we have done, because knowledge advances, abilities advance, and gradually we can get better and better at managing this waste in the best way possible, and eventually never give up the search for a real solution. We may be able at one day to find a solution. Perhaps science will develop a way that will allow us to neutralize this waste. Perhaps we will develop a way that we can safely put it into a place where it will be destroyed, like the center of the sun, for example. But until that day, it is our responsibility to the planet as well as to ourselves to guard it and to monitor it and to make it retrievable. This is called growing stewardship. In the meantime, we just have to admit that it was a big mistake embarking upon this exercise without having a solution. And therefore, we should stop producing it. We should stop producing more of it. The first problem is that the industry does not really want to solve the problem in the sense of getting rid of the waste. They simply want to clear the deck so they can make more. Now, if they make more, if the reactors continue to operate, even if they had a perfect geological repository, which probably doesn't exist, but even if they had one, if they put that waste as rapidly as possible into the underground repository, rapidly as possible is not very fast, because the reactor waste that comes out is so hot and so radioactive that it has to be cooled in a wet storage bin called a pool, a spent fuel pool, for at least 5 to 10 years. And then, even in dry storage, when it's taken out of the pool, it generates so much heat that you can't put it underground for a simple reason. When you put it underground, there's nowhere for the heat to go. And so the heat builds up, and you get a build-up of heat, which actually, we've done calculations in Canada. The Atomic Energy of Canada Limited has done calculations showing that the heat buildup, heating up the rock structures and cooling down again, takes about 50,000 years. And in the course of that time, it creates pressures, underground pressures, which can lead to pushing liquid water, which is going to fill the cavity once it's opened up. It's going to flood for sure. There's no question about that. You look at any abandoned mine, it's always flooded. And so that water is going to then have pressure to move outwards away from the waste because of the heat. That heat becomes a driving pressure, and that compromises the integrity of the repository itself. They can't put it down there too early. They have to wait. If we do that and we keep producing waste, then we have about 20 years worth of very hot, very radioactive waste sitting beside every nuclear reactor that's operating. Even if you put the older stuff underground as rapidly as possible, you still have disaster at the surface waiting to happen. Now, the hottest waste is the worst waste. The more recently it's out of the reactor, the more likely it is to disperse. The radioactivity falls off with time. So the worst is the freshest. And in fact, the stuff that's in the core of the reactor is the worst of all, because that stuff is so hot that just by shutting off the electricity, like as happened at Fukushima, the reactor will simply melt down under its own radioactivity. That's caused only by the radioactivity. Many people don't realize that all the destruction at Fukushima and at Chernobyl was caused not by the nuclear reaction, which was shut off, but by the radioactivity of the core. In other words, the radioactive waste is what did that damage. It just shows you how powerful this waste is. It's not inert like a rock. It's active. It produces heat. That's active. It produces chemical changes. That's active. It produces radioactivity, which gives off rays. That's active. And we've had one experience in Carlsbad, New Mexico, just a couple of years ago, where they had drums of low-level waste, not even as hot as this stuff, stored in barrels underground, 750 meters down deep. And one of those barrels exploded and turned into a flamethrower, and plutonium went up 750 meters to the surface, contaminated 22 workers, and then drifted downwind to Carlsbad, New Mexico. And what caused this? It was the fact that they used kitty litter as packing material, and the radioactivity causes chemical reactions to occur. Every scientist knows this. And the chemical reactions build up gas, and that gas is what exploded and burst the barrel and also ignited and turned it into a flamethrower. So you have to realize, people have to realize that this waste is active. It's not inactive. That's why we use the word radioactive. In fact, when we measure the radioactivity, we call it activity, because that's what it is. So this is why putting it underground is not a solution. It's really just a solution to the industry's public relations problem. They want to be able to point to something and say, look, we have a solution, ha ha ha, and therefore we can keep on producing it, making sure that it is not a solution. So people cannot be fooled by this. They also have to realize that the industry has a conflict of interest. They have a built-in conflict of interest. In Germany, they had a deep underground repository for low-level waste called the Acid 2 salt mine, and they put waste down there for many, many years. Turned out that that salt mine was leaking radioactivity for 10 years before the nuclear people in charge told the authorities that it was a problem. Why did they not tell the authorities right away? The reason is it would be bad public relations for the industry. So they have a conflict of interest. If things start going wrong, they don't want to tell people. In fact, we've seen this time and time again at 3 Mile Island with the Chernobyl accident. Don't tell people. Even at Fukushima, the TEPCO company, they lied about what was going on. They knew what was happening and they lied about it. Why? Because the industry has a huge public relations problem, and consequently they are conflicted when it comes to dealing with problems. They do want to deal with the problems, but even if the problem is beyond their ability to deal with, they don't want to confess to people or to the public that, in fact, things are going to hell in a handcart. So this is the reason why the industry itself cannot be in charge of this. You have to have an agency which is independent of the nuclear industry, which has no conflict of interest, an agency which is dedicated solely to protecting human health and the environment, to look after the long-term storage of this waste. At any rate, it's premature to even think about doing that over the long term until all the reactors are shut down. Then you have a manageable problem in the sense that you have a finite amount. Also, the hottest stuff, the stuff that was just produced this year, has a chance to cool off. And after 20 years or so, it is a lot less volatile. It's not any more likely to melt itself, for example, into the ground, suffer a meltdown. You begin to have a greater comprehension of the scope of the problem and the dimensions of the problem, and then you can sort of calmly go about figuring out what is really and truly the best way of making sure that this material stays out of the environment and out of the human thing. And if at some future time we are able to solve the problems connected with a longer-term solution, that can be implemented only when we really have the science. At the present time, we do not. Anybody, and I have been on panels confronting the people who are actually looking after the storage, geological storage of waste. We, in fact, had a 10-year environmental assessment with panels being held, public meetings being held by the government in 5 different provinces of Canada about the proposal for geological storage of nuclear waste. And the panel concluded that although by normal engineering standards, it would be judged to be reasonably acceptable in terms of safety. Because of the long term involved, because of the fact that there would be nobody on site to see what's happening underground, that changes the picture altogether, and in fact it's not acceptably safe under those circumstances. It's as if you built a huge machine like a nuclear reactor that was very dangerous, containing very dangerous materials, and you turned the button and then you just decided that nobody was ever going to look at it again. You were just going to walk away and let the machine look after itself. Now, that's what an underground dump is. When you put the waste underground, they call it a repository. It's really a dump. Because a repository is when you look after things. When you have a book repository at the Library of Congress, you have people there who are dedicated to keep those books in really good shape. They don't abandon them. So when we talk about disposal of nuclear waste, cross out the word disposal and put the word abandonment, because that's what we're really talking about. We're talking about taking the most dangerous material ever produced by any civilization, and material which is indestructible and will remain highly toxic for millions of years, and we are just simply going to abandon it. That is not an ethical position. We can't abandon it. We have to look after it. Rolling stewardship is an alternative plan, not a solution, but a plan for managing this waste. We do know how to package it. We do know how to take measures to stop it from contaminating the environment. That's what we have to do. The waste is active. We have to be active also.